Welcome, everybody, to A la Calle, Art, Design, and Discourse in Times of Turmoil in Latinx America, an event brought to you by the Latin Student Organization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design with the support of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin America Studies at Harvard. This event is accessible in both Spanish and English. For interpretation settings, please go to the globe icon on the bottom of your Zoom window and select your preferred language. Sean todos bienvenidos a La Calle, Arte, Diseño y Discurso en tiempos de tensión en
Welcome everybody to A la Calle, Art, Design, and Discourse in Times of Turmoil in Latin America, an event brought to you by the Latin Student Organization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design with the support of David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. This event can be listened to in both Spanish and English. For interpretation settings, please go to the globe icon on the bottom of your Zoom window and then select your preferred language.
Welcome, everybody. Latin GSD is an organization of students with two primary objectives. The discourse of topics that are relevant to Latin America, its diaspora, Latinx in the US, as well as fostering dialogue between Latin GSD and the diverse student groups at the GSD and across Harvard. This year's co-chairs are Jasmine Crespo, Cristina Dávila, Rogelio Cadena, Miguel Pérez, Martín Quiroga, and me, Gabriela Dávila. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people. The university evolved alongside the persistence of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations. Located near the Charles River, this place has long served as a site of meeting, exchange, and diplomacy among nations. With thousands of contemporary Native American people living in Greater Boston and tens of thousands in the state of Massachusetts.
Today's symposium, A la Calle, will consist of the participation of Delight Lab, Andrea and Octavio Gana from Chile, Regina José Galindo from Guatemala, Ronald Rael from the US, and Noemí Segarra from Puerto Rico. The event will run for approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes. We have 5 speakers with us today, and they will present their work for about 10 minutes each. After they finish, we will have a moderated discussion panel and a Q&A session, for which we encourage you to ask questions or comments on the Q&A box. A la Calle, Art, Design, and Discourse in Times of Turmoil in Latin America invites artists, architects, and social actors to present, debate, and speculate about the current and future state of creative practices in a regional context of turmoil. The current socio-political instability in the Latin American region and the criminalization of Latinx communities in the US invite us all to find physical and virtual spaces for reflection, action, and solidarity through the lens of art, architecture, and design.
This year's Latin GSD Symposium explores different models of interrogation, appropriation, and or consumption of the public space as an effective and inclusive platform for social outreach. By engaging various perspectives in the region, we aim to learn from these critical design practices to ultimately expand the portfolio of opportunities and develop new responses and action models via social agency, art, and design. In the current and fragile state of Latin America's socio-political environments, what are the opportunities we have to engage with the public? With this inquiry, we give it up for our first panelist, Delight Lab.
Hola a todos de todas partes del mundo. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I am Andrea Gana. Thank you for the invitation. and Octavio Gana, brother and sister. We are light artists, and we started the Light Lab more than 10 years ago. We will now share our presentation. We would like to tell you a little bit about the context. When we call for a la calle, to the streets, in the capital of Chile, Santiago, when we think of going to the streets, we really immediately think on a square that is so-called Dignity Square, which is characterized by a monument in the center and a huge tower that is called the Telefonica Tower. When we use the light for intervention, many of them was in this context with an important load when people gets to the streets to manifest and celebrate and calling for different historic events, especially in these 3 last years that we will focus. The images you have in the screen are our first light intervention in an unrest situation or demonstration. Once a killing was known that was on the hands of state agents of the current president Sebastián Piñera in Araucanía, which is where the Mapuche First Nation lives. And there was an assassination of Camilo Catrillanca under weapons. He was working on a tractor in a road. The camera of the police that attacked disappeared. There was quite a lot of confusion of some confrontation that never existed, and the country started to protest and demonstrate violently, and we felt really eager to do something. And we read in the Facebook of Raúl Zurita, our National Award poet, a text that was inspiring and with a lot of anger that finished with something that took our hearts. That says, the face should be covering the horizon. That clicked on us, and we were able to place it together with the face 2 days after this was known in what is so-called Plaza Italia, which is where the monument is, so-called Plaza Baquedano or Baquedano Square, and was the first intervention in the media to provide a different touch to this demonstration that was violent at the beginning, but then with total repression that was brutal. The next intervention I want to show you in the context of what is the well-known social unrest in Chile. This intervention was one of the sacrifice zones, so-called Ventana in Puchuncaví, in close to the port of Valparaiso, where many industry get together. These are contaminant companies or industries, and young children have diseases like cancer, lungs disease, and toxicity in the blood. It's not that we took the building, but it was done in the smoke itself. So it is terrible, but it's a sort of a Pink Floyd picture-like situation. So it was really strong in the social media. The other context that is interesting in what's happening in Chile, Chile possibly is the country with the more powerful privatization law for the resource water. There's rivers auction, and you can buy water that comes from the previous constitution written under the dictatorship, and something that we expect to change now. So this is a reservoir of water, and we had a light intervention with some carving representing the original ancestral people of the Mapuche First Nation, that is the spirit of water. Octavio, is this possible? You can come out of the full screen so people could see it, because I don't think that the slides are moving. Not at the beginning, no. We were able just to see the first one. You can move on if you want.
Sí, se ve.
Y ahora se ve.
Intenta.
Vamos a revisar las imágenes.
We will show you anyway the previous images so as to give you the context, which is these two. When you click next, we can't see them. Now you can see. We are in slide number 4 now. Can you see the tower? No, it says Zona de Sacrificio. Zona of Sacrifice. So it's taking a while. No, it's not moving. We can do it from PowerPoint if you want.
Yo creo que lo podemos ver así. Así se ven todos. Cuando está fuera de modo de presentación.
¿Así? Listo. Perdón el problema.
Sorry about that. So we were looking at the spirit of water, which was in the reservoirs of water in several cities in Chile to represent going back to what is essential, the essence, like water in this case, more than for consumption, is a good for life. And that is how life is. Then you have spirituality coming back to the essence. Now we will go to another one.
In October of 2019, something happened here in Chile. That is to say, a citizen revolution when the Metro of Santiago increases their fares in 30 pesos. It seems like little, but at that moment, we had a huge impact on students where the students basically protested, and we had a social movement where we're basically searching for dignity and equity, and there was a mass march in this square that we are showing. So that's why we had this projection called Dignity. There was a strong repression from the state, lots of violence, lots of police, and there was also curfews that were set forth. And we had curfews every night, and we projected a different word in response to what was occurring in a social political aspect. Here we share these images on the street, and therefore D-Light Lab became consolidated, especially with an activist format. So we were looking for a new country. We were looking for dignity and democracy. There were many interventions that we made during October and November of 2019. And then there was so much violence on behalf of the state that many people lost their eyesight. Rubber bullets were shot. People received impacts. Many people passed away and died. And in response to that, in the main buildings of the Catholic University, there's a Christ. And so we projected a Christ with a bleeding eye in response to what was occurring with the shots of these rubber bullets. We also presented a biblical piece just to respond to the social problems that are occurring. So what also happened, there was more than 33 deaths, murdered in very dubious circumstances. People were burned and others were murdered by bullets. And what you're seeing here, this was for New Year's. This is January 1st of 2020, where people basically took the space over. We had a national meeting. We did a projection of 10 words in order to inspire this new process. If we move forward, what you're seeing here, this was for 8M. This is a movement that's very powerful. That's a feminist movement that basically there's marches every year. And here you can see that this is taken off. This is the revolution, people on the streets. because we wanted it to remove the piñera as president. Then the pandemic arrived, so we did this projection for hunger. The government wasn't providing assistance and they wouldn't allow us to go out and work. Many people who work for their daily bread. So this projection, it did cause lots of controversy. And the next day we projected the word solidarity and humanity, and there was basically a light war. There was censorship. So we projected solidarity and humanity, and then there were large lights were projected, and we don't know who was behind that, but we basically set forth a judicial claim to know who was behind that, because that's a specific censorship. I'm going to move forward to this projection that says Renace, rebirth.
Adelantar quizás manual.
We're not seeing the slide. Maybe if you can move forward. We're still seeing dignity. Can you move the slides forward? We're still looking at the slide that says dignity.
¿No? Ya es que la estamos viendo online. Saquémosla online. Vamos a compartirla desde el escritorio.
Okay, we're going to share it from our desktop. So just give us a second to correct this technical glitch.
Okay.
No, es internet. ¿Ahí ven esa presentación?
Sí, ahora sí.
Can everyone visualize it now?
¿Se estará viendo ahora, no?
Can you see it?
A ver.
Ahí pueden ver la imagen.
Can everyone see the image now?
Slide, a ver si.
Esa justicia.
Sí, ahí.
It
Ya,
says
voy a-
justice.
rápido de las imágenes. Perdonen los problemas.
Please, we apologize for the technical glitch. This was for New Year. Here we have the words that were projected onto the buildings. We see people on the streets, the fireworks, laser shows,
Participando también.
and we also have the tower that's participating.
Esto fue lo que les contaba con la
So
pandemia.
this is what I mentioned in terms of the pandemic. We projected the word hunger, which it did cause lots of controversy.
Y esta es una imagen que también
Here's an image that was also powerful and scary as well. This was the censorship. This is anonymous censorship. Here we had some vehicles that appeared without a license plate with police security. And this was done during the pandemic, during curfew. So supposedly no one should have been out in the streets. And then once the approval was won, we projected the word rebirth. This is after the approval of the referendum. So this makes reference to the indigenous people. We have lots of First Nations people, and the largest group is Mapuche. So this is a historic photograph of 8M in the same area. Here's some interventions that we where police did not allow anyone to enter into this space, and with lights we began to create some interventions. This is a labyrinth or a maze, but the police force did enter this space. This is from a Chilean poet. It's called Pepe Cuevas, and it says, to destroy in our hearts the logic of the system. And then every Friday, people try to take over this square and to ignite the spark of revolution. And the government decided to remove this statue of Baquedano. And as they were removing it, once the statue is flying in the air, we projected the phrase to remove from its roots. And in our Instagram explanation, we say to remove the roots, fear, patriarchy, femicide, terrorism, violation to human rights, as amongst others. So the government wanted to remove it in order to protect it, to take care of it, given that all of us also want to remove that. So it's basically a double-edged sword. Here's an image that's related to repression. Here we have a circle around the police force. And to close and wrap up our presentation, we go back to the first questions that we always pose is, what do you understand by the word of democracy in this moment of pandemic, where the answer is when you ask for justice and social assistance and you are responded with repression and confinement. And so this is a summary of the interventions that we did in this tower. So we also ask at what point this is a public space, or is it a private space? And when do we stop perceiving this as a public space that are filled with propaganda and advertising? At one point, can the population basically take over this space to use it for performance, for art, to give this space back to the people? So this is our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delight Lab. As an audio, visual art and design studio that experiments around light, video, and space, it is interesting how you guys engage with both the public and not so public realm in your projects, and how it accompanies the social movement in projects that range from large-scale video projections on a building with video mapping techniques, digital museography, scenography design based on projections, but also you orchestrate these experiences on the basis of local identities, the preservation of natural resources, sacred territories, and most importantly, their spiritual culture. So thank you for that. Certainly, it explores parameters of projections and exhibits discourse on a building scale that also challenges the role of the body in the space when we're not able to be there in person.
Yeah, totally.
We are very excited to introduce the next panelist. Regina José Galindo is a visual artist and poet whose main medium is performance. Galindo lives and works in Guatemala, using its own context as a starting point to explore and accuse the ethical implication of social violence and injustices related to gender and racial discrimination, as well as human rights abuses arising from the endemic inequalities in power relations of contemporary societies. Galindo received the Golden Lion for Best Young Artist in the 51st Bienal of Venice in 2005 for her work, ¿Quién puede borrar las huellas? And Hymenoplastia. In 2011, she was awarded the Prince Claus Award from the Netherlands for her ability to transform injustice and outrage into powerful public acts that demand a response. In 2021, she won the Robert Rauschenberg Prize. She has also participated in the 49th, 53rd, and 54th Venice Biennales, Documenta 14 in Athens and Kassel, the 9th International Biennale of Cuenca, the 29th Biennale of Graphic Arts of Ljubljana, and Shanghai Biennale in 2016. The Biennale of Pontevedra in 2010, the 17th Biennale of Sydney, the 2nd Biennale of Moscow, the 1st Biennale of Auckland, the Venice Istanbul exhibition, the 1st Biennale of Art and Architecture, and the 2nd Biennale of Prague, and the 3rd Biennale of Lima. Es para mí un honor invitar a Regina a compartir su presentación.
It's an honor to present Regina.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello to everyone. I'm going to begin by reading a poem. I deny to believe that this is a country for men, to give birth to a female girl, and to her, I don't want to deny her rights. My grandmother earned it through her work. My mother, through difficulties, my sight I have to gain, or my place I gain it day by day. I decide, I gain, or I react, and I take action. I won't go out to the streets dressed as a man in order to face dangers, and I won't not go out either. I won't always be accompanied in order to avoid be assaulted, and I won't stop myself from going out. I don't want to be raped if I drink, but I won't stop drinking. I gave birth to a girl that's made for them. I want her to grow here with the open conscience and also be granted her rights. I am a poet, and I initiated my creative work at the end of the 90s, and we signed peace in 96. And when I decided that art was going to be my path or my journey, I belong to a generation of creators that in one way or another, we wanted to use the public space in order to express ourselves. We were signing peace in Guatemala. There were many years of utopia where we believed that things were going to change. And we felt that this space belonged to us, that we didn't face the dangers of previous years. So therefore, we took to the streets, and this utilization of this public space has accompanied me through these 22 years. And this is a selection of some of my works, and I'm going to share them with you.
Appearing. These are part of my first works in 1999 using public space. This is a flagship building, the post office, construction under the dictatorship of Ubico in the 40s. I took this public building and I start hanging. So this is 2003. Guatemala had a terrible person. It was not a dictator, it was only in government 2 years. Efrain Rios Montt. He was the president because of a coup d'etat up to 83. In 2003, he comes back to the political scene, becomes president of the Congress, modifying the constitution to become a presidential candidate. When he tells about his application or appoint to be appointed as candidate, I started with this road from the Constitutional Court up to the National Palace, and I have human blood in a bucket, and I put that in my feet, and I stamp until I arrive to the National Palace these footprints, in memory, of course, of more than 200,000 people who were killed in the Guatemalan genocide.
Este es el año 2012.
This is 2012. There was collective raping in a series in a very important avenue, which is Roosevelt Avenue. And after the whistleblowing of a very brave journalist about this problem and situation, there were many cases like this. In that stage, the president and vice president came out on TV saying that somewhat women were responsible in these actions or situations because they were coming out alone during the night. It was usually 7 to 9 p.m., which is the time in which girls are out after studying at the university. So that was the message, this horrible message about women should be accompanied during these times. And my answer is I rented this sign 4x6 for 3 months just to say, you won't rape. There's no ads, it's not arts, it's just this. A decree that works in countries that are religious with patriarchs. This goes beyond the borders. This is Ecuador's with 10 of these cubes in front of the church. This is in Spain, Zaragoza, Madrid. I presented this in different ways. When there's no money for renting a cube or a sign, then we do some painting in public spaces, but we need to put this message out in the public space. Do not rape. This intervention is more an activist thing, not an art piece in public space. I live in Antigua, Guatemala, one of the towns with more protection in the country. You know, our situation is really bad in our country. 20 raping situations in a day, 4 missing women. The index raised up to 7 women missing. In this Antigua, Guatemala town, one girl was killed. And what the mayor did was to keep this open hotel, and the excuse was protection to tourism. So with Esteban, my colleague, we had some intervention in the main square during the night with 4 mermaids were covered, and the fountain started the day with these messages in Maya, English, and Spanish to arrive to the tourists, trying to tell this reality of a country. More thorough actions. This is the black flag of Guatemala 4x6. I prepared in year 2000 for an arts show and an exhibition, and it went through the whole September where the National Day is celebrated, and I put this flag in different spaces, demonstrations, protests. This was in 2018, the last time it was in the public space. in the space where we struggle. That day, we were able to raise the flag because of some demonstrations where some students prevented from raising the flag. So we put the next day this flag, which was taken by that man in the image. This is March the 8th. In Guatemala 15 days ago, where I took my flag back, I prepared a new one. This is flag of 2 meters wide, 8 meters long. So what I do is I use it like a tail in feminine killing in this main road in the city, and I carry whatever comes inside of the street. This is fully painted as the celebration commemorating 8 of March was one day before. That's why the city looks like that. Then I close with this project, which I call it Appearing Germany, Public Spaces, Pandemic Work, when we are so restricted through subtle things. Violence in our body is not just happening in this side of the continent, but all over the world, which is the patriarchal system that will permeate to the whole society. In Germany, one person is killed by their couples. We say that in pandemic, this happens in a public space every 3 days. Thank you. With apparition, I finished my presentation.
Thank you so much, Regina, for your wonderful presentation and truly powerful work. I look forward to your response to some of the questions at the end of this lecture. Again, I want to take the time to ask everyone to submit your questions to the Q&A box so the speakers can respond later on. Up next, I'd like to introduce Ronald Rael. Ronald is an applied architectural researcher, author, design entrepreneur, and thought leader. He is currently the Eva Lee Memorial Chair in Architecture and director of the Masters of Architecture program with a joint appointment in the Department of Architecture in the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. Alongside Virginia Sanfrateo, Ronald is the director of Rael Sanfrateo, a studio that disrupts the conventions of architecture by tackling unconventional topics and scenarios. He is a thought leader in the fields of additive manufacturing and earthen architecture, and was named an emerging voice by the Architectural League of New York. one of the most coveted awards in Northern American architecture. So without further ado, please welcome Ronan Dryden.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Rogelio. I'm going to present in English. I'm the author of a book called Border Wall as Architecture, which is a biography of the wall that's constructed between the United States and Mexico. And within the book, it tells a series of stories of the problems that have arisen associated by the construction of the wall, and posits that the wall is in fact a form of architecture because it is designed, but it's the spaces that it affects have enormous consequences, not only on the people who live in these landscapes, but the ecologies and the environments. I've also been working on thinking about how this idea of the border and trying to define where the border is gives us an expanded view of where the borderlands are and even where Latin America is in fact is. And I'm coming to you from a place that is bordered by 14,000-foot mountains and crosses the border between the state of Colorado and the state of New Mexico. But until 1846, this was the northernmost territory of Mexico, suggesting that there is this larger borderlands that we often ignore, but which I think is a potent place for thinking and rethinking about design in this context. In this context, the history and memory of those borderlands remains. And I'm currently working on restoring about 9 different structures made out of adobe in this landscape. This is mud brick, including my own house, which is a 5th-generation house that belongs to my family, made out of mud, which I use as an instrument for teaching traditional and indigenous building technologies, like making adobe, plastering with this material, but also indigenous traditional foodways, like making these traditional mud ovens called hornos that are used traditionally throughout Colorado and New Mexico, but also throughout the Americas. And this has given birth to a project called Pedacito de la Tierra, in which I am moving across the US-Mexico border, building mud ovens in migrant shelters to bring together the communities that are stuck along the border in those shelters. I'm going to play you a clip from a documentary film that was recently made called Pedacito de la Tierra.
¿Qué construimos? Me encanta. Aquí reconstruimos personas y reconstruimos la humanidad.
Como te digo, soy guatemalteco, ya no soy ningún muchacho jovencito. Acostumbramos a hacer el pan según la costumbre de nuestro pueblo. Tú me dices si se está abriendo para poner más madera, porque ya estamos muy close.
This project of building hornos and migrant shelters is one about not only bringing communities together around fire and food and recipes, because you have to remember in these shelters, there are people from not only across the Americas, but from across the world, coming from different countries with different traditions. And these hornos are kind of like a new kind of passport, a passport without the violence embedded in the document that allows one to move from country to country, but it's a passport to reinforce their own traditions as they are stuck in a moment on a journey that they are taking. That particular film sequence is really beautiful to me because they're asking the nun who runs this particular shelter, what are you building here? And the obvious answer is the horno that we're all building. But her answer is, what are we building? And she thinks about it carefully and said, what are we building? We are not building, we are rebuilding, and we are rebuilding humanity here. We are rebuilding people emotionally and physically in these shelters and bringing them together around this object, this historic object in cooking technology that spans the Americas. This interest of mine in the land itself, and there's this saying in the borderlands, las fronteras nos dividen, pero la tierra nos une. The borders divide us, but the land unites us. And how can we think about how this material underneath our feet can unite us in different ways? And the borderlands are a hybrid place. They're a place where food and culture, different languages, different foods, different cultures come together and they rub up against each other in interesting ways, in violent ways, sometimes ridiculous ways. So how can we think about other ways of making in this landscape? One way is to think about the technologies that come to this landscape. And we have migrated 3D printers into this landscape to think about how we can use this same material that's been used for thousands of years in these contexts to make new kinds of forms and new spaces. And so we've been working on how we can take very accessible robots that we've made ourselves, which are low cost, bring them out into remote environments, use the earth underneath our feet in order to produce potentially housing and the objects that would go into a house, furniture, functional pottery, ceramics. And so over the course of the pandemic, we've been working on a project called Casa Covida. Covida doesn't mean COVID, but for us it means the house of cohabitation in the time of COVID. There's obviously the suggestion here about the possibility of thinking how maybe one aspect of thinking about this particular time of trauma in Latin America is to reassert its own building technologies using Adobe. And we're working on how we think about how we make spaces for sleeping, places that reinforce the textile and craft traditions of the region. So all these textiles were handmade particularly for this structure. They even have the plan of the building on the pillows. Places for cooking and gathering, places for bathing, looking at the sky. All done for a very low cost. We made this pneumatic structure that instead of a roof, we have this inflatable structure that defines the roof. So while we were working on this project in the borderlands, rethinking how we might use an ancient building technology in a new way, we're also confronted with the continued discussion of child separation at the US-Mexico border. And because we're in the remote environment, we wanted to contribute in some way. We did a very fast charrette thinking about how we can use graphic design as a tool, as an instrument that our friends could use in protests in the cities, in Oakland, in New York, in San Francisco, and Los Angeles. So we wanted to build on this particular sign, which is very iconic in the borderlands. And many people have re-envisioned this sign for different reasons, for particularly to tell political stories in the borderlands. But what we discovered is that this sign has a very unique history in the borderlands. It was designed by a Navajo graphic designer who was working for the California Department of Transportation, and he was assigned to design a sign that warned motorists that immigrants might be dropped off alongside the road by coyotes and warn motorists so that they wouldn't be hit. This designer named John Hood saw the plight of the immigrant today as that of the Navajo during the Long Walk, when they were forced to migrate from their own traditional homelands to where they are today in New Mexico. John Hood himself is from New Mexico. So he embedded activism within this sign because of that. He put a little girl with pigtails because he thought that's who motorists might empathize with the most. But interestingly, he used the silhouette of the civil rights leader Cesar Chavez as the head of the father. And so we wanted to build upon the genius of this sign, and we made one simple move, which was to turn the family to face each other. And we made this available for download on the web. Anyone could download and print it out and use it in protest, which it did. But then we started to build larger signs to install alongside the highway, especially near the child detention centers that were being constructed at the time. But we had the opportunity to bring this sign to the highway as the last versions of the original sign were being removed from the highway along Orange County in the form of a giant billboard called Reunite, seen by hundreds of thousands of people. And this open source method of smuggling into design into places where activism maybe wasn't always present continued. You can see this wall today, this sign on the wall of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine at 110th and Amsterdam in New York City. And people continue to download this sign, and they're making their own signs in Los Angeles and putting them up all over the city. It was at one time the facade of the Johnson Museum in an exhibition about border art, but very controversial because embedded within it, of course, is this political message. during this same time, the continued conversations about continued wall construction and continued child separation escalated. And within that book that I mentioned in the beginning, which is a biography of the US-Mexico border wall, which of course exists, it wasn't something that Donald Trump built. There was over 700 miles of wall constructed at the time that Donald Trump entered into office, and his own regime only constructed 15 miles of border wall. We documented these stories, and one of the stories happened to be about the equities and inequities between the United States and Mexico, the labor and trade balances. And so one of the illustrations in the book is this drawing called teeter-totter wall. Teeter-totter wall grows from the idea of not only these imbalances and balances that exist, but also this notion of the justice scales and what that means. And so these are two of the illustrations from that book called Teeter-Totter Wall, one in the form of a drawing, one in the form of a recuerdo, we call them, so a souvenir or a memory of the time that the United States built a border wall and what a ridiculous idea that was. But it's often perceived that these are proposals for the border, when in fact they're illustrations of what is happening at the border today. But this particular illustration caught a lot of attention, and we wanted to see if it was possible to begin to think of some of this work as propositions and what it would mean to build this as an actual object in the world, and what it would mean to smuggle design to the border to demonstrate how play can be a form of activism. We designed the way that it would sit on the wall, to think about the wall as a literal fulcrum between US-Mexico relations, what it would mean to dimensionally, how to slide in handlebars and seats. And we worked with art collective in Juarez called Colectivo Chopeque to fabricate the teeter-totters. And we built them out of the same material that the wall is constructed of itself. So it's like we're dismantling the wall, but using the wall itself as a weapon against the wall. This is the very first slide of the teeter-totter wall. And what does it mean to smuggle? Here you see this monument, which if you cut this monument in half, one side is in Mexico and the other side is in the United States. And because the wall is a US project, you can see that it's built about 1 meter into the United States. So those footprints that you see, those huellas that you see there, those are in the United States on the Mexican side. But if you look a little bit closer, you see that literal fulcrum that I'm talking about between US-Mexico relations, anticipating the arrival of the teeter-totter. We worked with the communities there to think about how we would, we use these banana seats and the handles and the bells. I guess they're not in this photo, but we thought about changing the color of this. And it was decided that we would paint the teeter-totters pink because we had to recognize that pink in Juarez means something very important. Every time you see a pink cross, it remembers the women who were killed in the femicides during the time of violence in Juarez, and that while we were using play as a form of activism, we had to remember that the wall is a structure of violence and oppression. And one day we simply had enough, and we decided to impale the dragon with these weapons. And this is how it went down. Maybe I'll just let you watch. There was not a moment before we inserted these pink sticks into the wall that a child had jumped on it immediately, connecting families on both sides of the border. The event was intended by mostly the women, mothers and grandmothers and children from the communities, especially on the Mexico side, because in Nanapra, the colonia comes right up to the wall itself. And I think what we discovered in this project is that the US Border Patrol arrived and asked us what we were doing. We did not ask anybody's permission to do this. And when they arrived, we told them that we are having an event with children, and they stood back and they watched and they smiled and they took pictures. Minutes later, the Mexican National Guard arrived, heavily armed, and they too asked what we were doing, and they stood back and they watched and they smiled. We asked both if they wanted to participate, and they said no, which would have been amazing if we'd got Border Patrol and the Mexican National Guard to ride the Tito's on her. But I think most importantly, we presented a new narrative of this landscape. The narrative presented by the previous regime and those before them are that the borderlands are a no man's land where no one lives and where bad men are doing bad things. But instead, this is a landscape where women and children and families live and experience joy despite the oppression and violence of the wall. And for 40 minutes, completely accidentally, we had the opportunity to show the world that the actions that take place on one side have a direct consequence on the other. Muy bien, gracias.
Thank you, Ronald, for showing us your wonderful work. I think it's critical to understand the effect that simple lines on a map can have on the spatial experiences within a community. Talking about fixed borderlines and territory, I think serves as an interesting transition to the work of Noemí Segarra, where most of her work focuses on temporality and movement. Noemí Segarra Ramírez is PISO's initiator. She is an organizer in the experimental dance, somatic, and social justice fields in Puerto Rico. Her socially engaged art practice emphasizes process, research, documentation, and the creation of archives. PISO likes to create dialogue about processes. They produce live experiences and memories as a way to intercept reality, which might change social behavior or the rules of the game, even if only momentarily. After almost 2 decades working in Latin America and the United States, Noemí returned to Puerto Rico in 2008 to create a space for the consistent study of the body and vanguard expressions. So please welcome Noemí Segarra. I will share the screen now.
Gracias, Gabriela.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, team. What I would like to talk about is about the body. The body as our own, as the best technology or point of departure to come in and out, to generate knowledge. I think and I feel that a constant in my job is to look for my place in the world we know, particularly Puerto Rico, which is a colony of the United States of America. This subject matter we have been hearing and receiving from other panel members of depression, oppression, violence to some bodies in a repetitive way with numbers and figures that are not healthy at all. And this division and classification of a body according to gender, sexual orientation, the borderline set divisions, then I cite borders divide us, but the earth, the land unites us. So that piso, in Spanish, that floor, is a platform, intergeneration, that will serve as a container or a frame that is safe to meet each other in with our body, with the questions we have, with our presence. Gabriela, if you want, you can just put the images to flow or point that first video, which I said is 0. Okay, just keep that. This is structured improvisation. Gabriela is supporting me with the images. So piso, which is floor in Spanish, is a platform for study our own body in relationship with other human beings, but also with the environment. And I think that is supremely important with the elements, with the light, with natural light, with water, the land itself, the air, the sounds, and within that, to feel yourself in and listen to yourselves, making decisions in full awareness from now and here. From what you see Jasmine inside, Jasmine Crespo, and Andrea Bausa, two professors of University of Puerto Rico who we work together with architecture students. We are in the field study, preparing a space, and the participative design embodying this interaction with the surrounding in a direct way with a workshop inside of the space to receive that from your body and in presence. With Andrea and Jasmine, we built in 2013 the mobile floor, piso móvil, which was occupying a space which is an empty lot, which we really discovered through inhabiting space, taking that space. We discovered it's a very humble community from Dominican Republic residents or artists, or people with low income that was displaced in the hands of the government of Puerto Rico and for the capital interest. When this great space that is empty appeared, I'm a person who walks in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, there's high dependency for car. Public transportation has disappeared in the 49 years I have been witnessing how this was disassembled in the public transportation in our archipelago. And then I insist in go walking every day. That's a practice and a conscious decision that is challenging this individualistic dependence, separating you to be immersed, embedded with your environment. So piso, so we could go back to the project. With this platform, we use it as a verb. Piso is the verb, but in present is like you walk one step, you take action. To talk about the intention of the project, take action, take the public space, start a practice that is started in my living room. Noemí, myself, since I was very young, I started a movement to look for harmony and regulate myself with my surrounding environment, which was my domestic space. I never understood what was happening because I suffered verbal aggression or domestic violence or lack of communication, if you want. So I didn't get the information or a way to process and proceed and be in harmony. So I started with the knowledge by the intuition of the body to regulate myself, to calm myself. Then I went back to Puerto Rico in 2008 with the intention to make this possible, this space for experimental dance. So we could deconstruct and decolonize the view, understanding that the process is maybe more important than the product because the body with their decisions will generate mobile architecture and a design of our reality in a continuum. As the body, I understand it as the best technology ever existing, then the practice is studying the body improvising movement as a methodology and a strategy for survival in the Caribbean. That's my hypothesis. And in Puerto Rico, of course. Then this calls for the improvising as a practice that goes for freedom to locate life and assure your life that is so patriarchal, heteropatriarchal, according to the patriarchal vision that is not helpful. As we have heard other panel members, we are looking at different ways, facing in different ways a structure problem. So then I go back to the structure of the body itself, acting collectively in order to take some space and to study ourselves, to study our decisions, being it what I'm doing with my body now and what I imagine in the long term, and how can I imagine this future, then again reflecting present and the way in which I could consciously re-articulate this decision making. That's my invitation, in fact, of piso. This image we see, mobile floor in an exhibition that is so-called fuera de sala, out of the room. When we were preparing this mobile floor as parts of a puzzle that was being put together, we were putting that together and we needed to look at that. Again, this is another piso workshop. Andrea Bausa, one of our collaborators. Go on, go on. This is a class that comes out of piso practices that would like to expand this conversation, not just to the artists of the movement, but citizens, in a more extensive way, so we could think and situate ourselves in the public space as the need that we have is to be a pedestrian. We took the streets because of complaints that we proposed that was taking the guy out of government. And we will be taking the streets as we did in pandemic, the group of feminists in construction and many other groups that were very active because gender violence is escalating with the current conditions. Things that we've communicated already, which are our problems as humanity. In each of the geographies, we see these particular cases. This is having breakfast in the street, which is a call from our collaborator colleague Andrea Bausa to take public space so we could share these daily and human thing or ritual of having breakfast. This was in solidarity with the students with the major hunger of 2017 in Universidad de Puerto Rico, then Andrea and Noemi with two classes that we designed. We put together our force and we were building in that semester, that last semester I was teaching at UPI, we built Piso Phoenix. Piso Phoenix is again a collaborating participative design and construction with the students of two classes, gender and city and urbanism. I think in the next image you have Piso. That's myself in Cerro Gordo, Pachamama, original floor or original piso. Next image, body and city Piso Phoenix with women in Puerto Rico. That is a collaboration between the class. We wanted an interdepartmental course, but bureaucracy didn't allow, but we did it in collaboration. The next image is the design itself, and the last one I think is Piso Phoenix with Piso collaborators. Tell me about the time left, please. I think we will close here because there was a video, but it will take all the time, so we better wrap it up. Well, you can ask questions. I feel I am silencing lots of things that I had to say. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Noemi. There will be lots of questions, no doubt, about this in the Q&A from our people in the audience.
We would like to start with a reflection A la calle invite us to reflect on the current socio-political instability on global scales. Taking art and design into the world demands a new poetic infrastructure. In the encounter, the social and the poetic withstand. The body, the building, the artifact, and the context offer its skin deep to make visible how injustice, oppression, violence, and gender inequality. Regina José Galindo foregrounds a methodology in opposition to violence. Her work, Suelo Común, from 2013, was never simply a hole on the ground. It was an elaborate, extended performance of cutting and exhibiting a unique form of forensic mapping, representing a collective political and spatial fossa. Galindo embodies everything brutal about extreme terror. Her body is set up as a new topography, a body perpetually frightened with murder. For Noemí, urgent dances becomes a critical stance. El transeúnte redefines the act of protestar. La calle, la plaza, la acera, public is an important platform for the struggle. A game of inches. Cuerpos y cuerpas are always moving. The practice contains a specific level of performance and interpretation of space that is physical and experiential. It is a kind of sidestep improvisation or pattern upon space, sparing of spatiality. Andrea and Octavio proyectan a different type of territory, acting on building surfaces. Palabras louder than bombs. Hambre, zona de sacrificio. For language is never innocent. As Roland Barthes notes, words have a second-order memory. Here, I also recount Octavio Paz, Los hijos del limo, mis puntos de vista son los de un poeta hispanoamericano. No son una disertación desinteresada, sino una exploración de mis orígenes y una tentativa de autodefinición indirecta. He questions, what do poems say? And responds that a poem is the product of both history and society, but its historical ways are contradictory. A poem is a machine that produces anti-history, even without the poet proposing it. I suggest that we rewrite the history of human relations, taking this condition of active engagement, of being in the world as our starting point. Further, in reflecting of Ronald's question, isn't it fascinating how the simple act of drawing a line on the map can transform the way we see and experience the world? Borders in between spaces become places. End of quote. Indeed, the landscape tells, or rather is, a story. Those lines create scars in the landscape and our memories. As Tim Ingold notes, footprints are individuals, paths are social. Nowadays, art, design, and discourse as form of expression communicate both individual and collective perspectives. They can speak to and confront social issues of inequality. In our current context of social spatial unrest, collective ways of resistance seem imperative, as they help reshape the environments that are complicit in our experiences of inequality. Considering this, for the panelists, how do you all embrace conflict as an outreach opportunity? Any one of you can start answering the question. Cualquiera de ustedes puede comenzar con esa pregunta.
Yo quiero empezar.
Bien.
Yo facilito sanación
I
a
want to
través
begin.
del contacto con las manos.
I use my hands. I give massage therapy for us to understand. So people come to me to just kind of relax and, break down the knots in their bodies. These are trigger points, like points of conflict where energy is not flowing, or connecting the first structure, which is oneself. So I think that the conflict is a space for coming together when things aren't working, that from the present, the time and now, we can solve and generate a new design or find another solution. People come to me to move things, literally. So, okay, that's my comment.
I don't know if any other panelists would like to answer. If not, perhaps this is a starting point to address some of our audience questions.
Well, I see one question in the Q&A that's directed towards me, so maybe I'll start by. The question is from Luis Matos. He's saying, during the months of pandemic, even with the change in government, how many immigrants have the ovens helped during their transit? And any idea of the different countries of origin? Have you been mapping this movement? I have not been mapping the movement, but I know that at that particular shelter in Nogales, there are between 200 and 400 residents. And at that time, there were about 200 residents in place, and most of those residents have been stuck there for almost a year. There, in fact, have been children born at the shelter and are beginning to grow up in shelters because they cannot continue their journey. They cannot apply for asylum under the bureaucracies and put in place by the previous regime. And so the shelters are in flux, but I think mostly lately they have been fairly static, but I think now in the last couple of weeks they are growing. And so there will be more hornos built in shelters in Tijuana and Matamoros are next, but also in Portugal and in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in Colorado. Oh, the last part of that question is, where are they from? So in that shelter at that time, there were residents from Mexico, Guatemala, Brazil, Cuba, and Russia. So you can see how there's so many people from different places and different traditions and customs coming together, and new kinds of communities have to be formed.
Great.
Bueno, al final, yo considero que en la medida en
I
que
consider that while Ronald is talking about all these nationalities, we can see that in the map, many stakeholders appear. But there's one that we can visualize, especially in your practice. But this is the question that Claudia has, and where Ronald shares his interaction with police in the border. But it would be interesting to know from the rest of you how you deal with governments and the police force and other sources of power.
el miedo hacia las
What about the
acciones
fear against legal suits? This is a variable that conditions you in these activities. But then I also want to ask how in this scenario of different players right now,
sumar o aportar.
well, the government can either promote your cause or it can basically make it more difficult.
Nosotros podemos responder.
So we would like to respond from our side because we have dealt with police repression. We have the possibility of being anonymous, or we can do activities showing who we are as we are. And we chose the second for safety because it was very easy to detect us and visualize us. And by making this public, people would know that if something would happen to us, they would know if something happened to us at the end of the day. So that happened at the beginning. And then later when we began to receive threats and censorship, our Instagram account was hacked and we were actually fearful. So then a young group of lawyers, a foundation came to us and they offered legal advice. They gave us some protective resources, and we got the community together. The community became involved to protect us, and that was very important when we were working in these social issues and feel that we're being supported and we're not alone and that we are not immobilized by fear.
Bien, muchas gracias, Andrea y Octavio. Tenemos otra pregunta.
Thank you, Andrea and Octavio. I have another question for Regina, as well as Noemí. Alejandra asks, with femicides that have occurred in a large number in different parts of the world, in Mexico, especially with 10 femicides a day, you as activist women using your bodies as platforms as a protest, my question is, how do you mitigate violence and how does this impact you personally? Well, first of all, I want to put this into context, and that is to say, the situation of femicides doesn't appear. This is not a fact that appeared 1 or 2 or 5 years or 10 years. This is the reality that we have lived from the origins of society when patriarchies were formed. In my case, I don't see myself affected through my work. I find that my work is a space for resistance and for a fight. Let's not talk about the Mexican reality or the Guatemalan reality. This happens all over the world. This is a global issue. So how do we prepare ourselves? When you utilize our bodies as a medium, we have to be conscious of the limitations and the strengths that we have, and also finding points of self-care, for example. And I think that self-care and mental health is not a space, really, where we artists use our bodies. We need to inhabit them, but these are spaces that everyone has to inhabit. And we need to access ourselves in order to be peace with ourselves and to be peace with the rest of society. So in order to respond, for me, my work, I don't see myself affected by my work. I am affected by reality. I would also like to answer, because for me, what I search for, I want to promote through imagination and creativity and that space of freedom that art gives to me to expand that conversation or that possibility so that, well, everyone, we all have bodies. And that self-care, if it's community-based, it's magnified. And how do we harmonize? We also find peace in the midst of oppression, but we also organize ourselves and we convoke community so we can be more in numbers and we can change current situations, especially in many situations that aren't sustainable. In Puerto Rico, there's many movements. Of course, there's femicides, and we also have the LGBTQ community that also leads manifestations. And since 2019, we've had a new leadership that challenges this patriarchy and patriarchal state. We organize ourselves differently. So BISO is, well, in the University of Puerto Rico, this is basically a great hub for this activist movement to rethink ways of working and do things differently. So I want to make changes through a daily task. And I'm also human, not just an artist. And I had to walk in Puerto Rico day and night and feel safe. So that's part of my conversation. And this is something that hasn't been solved. This is ongoing.
Great. So there's another question from Ken Ismael Santiago Pagan. He asked, for all panelists, something common that I got from all of the projects is that in their own way, they address some kind of management of memories of places, events, stories, bodily experiences, conflict, and historical trauma. How crucial is memorialization for achieving transitional justice?
So we believe that art is basically something that helps us show a fight. This is a fight for freedom, and this is also brings about debate. So we want to take this public space. This, well, we have art galleries or museums. That's just something more traditional, but we want to take over the spaces in the street, and we want to basically show different milestones. And this is a collective effort, and we take this public space. We like to just do performances that are that have rituals, and we also work with ancestral cultures in order to create a new imagination. So therefore, we create more strength through the community. At least in our territory, we believe that it should be this way everywhere. Now, to talk about memory, this is an important pillar in my work. So evidently speaking, in the way we live, the history and stories, and well, these are stories that are told by the powerful. This is not the story of our humanity. So in some way or another, art and the fight and the spaces of resistance, well, they could be these mechanisms that one way or another will promote a change in the veracity of these stories or narratives. So art in public spaces can be that grain of salt in order to change that story or narrative, and that's worthy. I also consider that art is a space of fighting, and this can trigger change, and the best place to fight is in this public space. I also want to add, and this deals with what we are hearing here. If the narrative was told by women, it would be a totally different story. For me, it's interesting to imagine that from our own bodies, our female body, this is something that I didn't speak of in my presentation, but the self-documentation, take the iPhone or whatever, which you have in hand, that from my point of view, not the male gaze, but me, myself. It's I'm not perfect, and sometimes things don't work, but this is my reality. This is a reality that what is it? I want to share it with you. This is my view, my vision to activate, this sense of urgency. But now with our technology, cellular phones and devices, we can use these platforms. So PISO has a platform. Technology and also our bodies. Our bodies are also files that generate these experiences. So we need to generate new spaces to gather as a community. But for me, to be present and generate these memories is part of this utopia, to be able to embody them, that I am going to tell my story. No one's going to tell my story for me. So I'm convoking the poet, the Puerto Rican poet who says, who I was called my route. Actually, everyone has their own path, my path, and you have the, right to tell your own story.
Okay, it is now pretty close to the time to finish the session, and I wouldn't like to forget this question for the 4 panel members, which is a very interesting question, and it's also special. Oscar Malta is from Brazil. He says, I'm grateful for the generous meeting.
Space as a territory for the formation of the imaginary, of the dreams. If a Black body is 18 times more likely to be in risk than a white one in public spaces in Northeast Brazil, for example.
¿Puedo hablar? Dale.
Ronald, te escuchamos.
Yes. Okay. You want me to answer?
Repetimos la traducción. Estoy agradecido de esta generosa reunión. Quiero saber si en el espacio público, en territorio, la formación de lo imaginario, si un cuerpo negro es 18 veces más probable que muera que un cuerpo blanco en los espacios públicos. Lo que a mí me fascina
that it is our decision what happens there in that space, because in many ways, despite this constant message that someone else would pay for this wall, in fact, the taxpayers paid for this wall. And there was actually a moment when the Border Patrol was interviewed and they were asked by a right-wing television station, is what those artists did illegal? And the Border Patrol agent changed his tune entirely, said, oh no, that was entirely legal. It's like sitting on a fence at a courthouse. And so that demonstrated to me that we can take ownership of these spaces as artists, as the public, and decide what happened there. The second part of the question, I can't speak so well to in Brazil, but certainly that's the same issue that we have in the United States and many countries around the world. So we have to decide about what happens in these public spaces. And I think that there's this combination between what is design and what is activism. And in my opinion, almost everything that a designer does is what an activist does, except for one thing. I mean, the things that they share in common is that they work with different audiences, they work with different constituencies, they attempt to transform and make change. And there's a long list of things that activists and designers share in common, but the one thing that designers do not share in common with activists is activists are willing to get arrested for their cause. And I think that opens up the question from the previous question is, like, are we as designers, as creative people, as artists, willing to be arrested for the things that we do in public spaces to transform change? And I think we saw that in the Black Lives Matter movement, both the activists and creative endeavors that were put forward during that time. Paso el popcorn.
I think, so thank you so much, Andrea, Octavio, Regina, Ronald, and Noemi. So much for collaborating with us. Thank all of you for joining a la calle, our symposium. We would also like to thank the David Rockefeller Center for Latin for their support. We ask you to please follow the Latin GSD accounts on Instagram and Facebook for next events. Gracias y buenas noches.
Buenas noches a todos. Gracias.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Noemí, Regina, Andrea, Octavio, todos.
Un placer compartir con
Tremendo.
grandes artistas y la
It was a
invitación.
pleasure sharing with these wonderful artists, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you. Goodbye. Good night. It was a wonderful moment knowing your work. It was an incredible meeting, very inspiring. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Good night. Thank you.
Gracias, intérprete. Gracias, Yasmin.
Gracias,
Gracias.
gracias, Michelle. Y a cada persona
De nada.
las personas que
Gracias.